Paris, the summer of 1902. Past midnight in a wooden shed behind the École de Physique that the university itself would not dignify with proper heating or a solid floor, a woman in an ink-stained apron let herself in through a door that did not lock properly and never had. She had been coming here after dark for months, drawn back by something she could not entirely explain to her husband, who teased her gently about it and came along anyway. She did not light a lamp. She did not need to. On the shelves and workbenches around her, in glass vessels she and Pierre had filled themselves, a faint blue-green light glowed in the dark, not warm, not bright, but unmistakably, defiantly present. She was looking at radium, pure enough finally to see with the naked eye. A new element, one she and her husband had built an entirely new branch of physics in order to find. She did not yet know what it would eventually cost her. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. She was born Maria Salomea Skłodowska in Warsaw in November 1867 into a country that did not, on any map of the period, officially exist. Poland had been partitioned out of existence over a century earlier, carved between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and the Warsaw of her childhood sat inside the portion controlled by the Russian Empire. A city where the Polish language, Polish history, and Polish self-governance were treated by the occupying administration as threats to be managed rather than facts to be respected. Her parents were both educators, and both in different ways paid a price for that occupation's suspicion of educated Poles. Her father lost a school administrative post for his nationalist sympathies and never fully recovered his former income. Her mother, who ran a respected girls' school, died of tuberculosis when Maria was 10. Education in this household was not simply a value. It was survival, resistance, and grief, braided together into a single inheritance. She grew up fluent in the particular skill of a colonized intelligentsia, excelling within a system built to limit her while quietly building another life outside it. That second life, clandestine, communal, and fiercely intellectual, would shape everything that followed. As a girl, Maria Skłodowska was the kind of student teachers remembered decades later without needing to consult their records. She finished secondary school at 15 with the top gold medal in her class, having already absorbed, alongside official Russian language instruction that erased Polish history from the curriculum, a second and unofficial education delivered in secret. She was a participant, later an organizer, in what became known as the Flying University, a rotating underground network of lectures held in private apartments across Warsaw, teaching Polish history, science, and literature to young people, especially young women, who had no legal access to a Polish university education. Being caught could mean prison or exile. She attended anyway. Formal university study, however, was closed to her at home. Warsaw's university did not admit women. So she and her older sister Bronisława struck a pact that would define both their 20s. Maria would work as a governess for several years, sending part of her wages to support Bronisława's medical studies in Paris. And once Bronisława qualified as a physician, she would return the favor. It was, in effect, a private sisterly scholarship fund built entirely on deferred ambition and trust. The governess years were not simply a waiting room. In one of the households where she worked, she fell in love with the family's eldest son, Kazimierz Żurawski, a mathematics student home from university. He returned her feelings. His parents did not return their blessing. A penniless governess was not the match they had in mind for their son's future, and the relationship was quietly, painfully ended. Żurawski would go on to a distinguished academic career of his own. Decades later, as an old man, he reportedly kept a statue of Marie Curie on his university office desk. What that gesture meant to him privately is not something the historical record can access. What it suggests is that the ending cost more than either family let show at the time. In 1891, at 24, she finally left for Paris to join Bronisława, enrolling at the Sorbonne under the French spelling of her name, Marie. She lived, by her own account and by design, on almost nothing, a series of unheated garret rooms, meals sometimes reduced to bread, butter, and tea, fainting once from malnutrition in her lodgings. She was there to study, not to be comfortable, and she was extraordinarily good at it. In 1893, she placed first in her class for a physics degree. The following year, she placed second in mathematics. It was in 1894, while seeking laboratory space to study the magnetic properties of steel, that she was introduced to a French physicist 8 years her senior named Marie Curie. Pierre already held a serious scientific reputation of his own. Years earlier, he and his brother Jacques had discovered piezoelectricity, the property by which certain crystals generate an electric charge under mechanical stress, a discovery that would later prove essential to Marie's own research. What began as a professional introduction became, within a year, a marriage, a small, unceremonious wedding in July 1895. Marie, in a plain dark dress, she would go on wearing to the laboratory for years afterward, because it was practical. Their scientific partnership deepened almost immediately. When Marie began searching for a doctoral research topic in 1897, she settled on a peculiar recent finding by the French physicist Henri Becquerel: uranium salts, without any exposure to light or external energy source, spontaneously emitted a form of radiation capable of fogging photographic plates and passing through solid matter. Scarcely anyone else in physics was paying it much attention. Marie decided to make it her doctorate. Using one of Pierre's piezoelectric instruments, repurposed to measure the extremely faint electrical currents produced when this uranium radiation ionized the surrounding air, she began systematically testing every element and mineral sample she could obtain. She found that thorium produced the same effect. And she found something stranger still. A uranium ore called pitchblende was significantly more radioactive than the pure uranium extracted from it, which meant, by her reasoning, that the ore had to contain something else entirely, something undiscovered, present only in trace amounts, and far more radioactive than uranium itself. She also arrived at a conceptual leap that mattered as much as any single discovery. This radiation was not a chemical reaction between molecules, as chemistry had always explained energetic processes before. It appeared to be a property of the atom itself, something happening inside matter at a level physics had not yet mapped. She gave this property a name that has outlived nearly everything else about the century in which she coined it: radioactivity. Pierre set aside his own research on crystals to join her hunt for whatever was hiding in the pitchblende. Working together through 1898, they isolated 2 new elements from tons of processed ore. In July, they announced the first, polonium, named for Marie's occupied homeland, a small act of scientific defiance aimed squarely at an empire that had tried to erase Poland from the map. In December, working with the chemist Gustave Beaumont, they announced the second and far more radioactive radium. Announcing an element and holding it in your hand, however, are 2 different achievements, and the distance between them consumed the next 4 years of Marie's life. To prove radium existed as a genuine chemical element rather than a hypothesis, she needed to isolate a measurable, weighable quantity of it in pure form, and the concentration of radium in pitchblende was so vanishingly small that this meant processing tons of raw ore by hand in that leaking, drafty shed the university had grudgingly loaned them, stirring boiling cauldrons of chemical residue with an iron rod nearly her own height, in conditions she would later describe with surprising fondness and modern occupational science would describe as appalling. By 1902, she had isolated a decigram of pure radium chloride and determined its atomic weight. The element was real, named, weighed, undeniable. In 1903, Marie became the first woman in France to earn a doctorate in physics. That same year, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences prepared to award the Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of radioactivity, initially naming only Pierre Curie and Henri Becquerel. Marie's central role had been omitted from the nomination entirely. Pierre, learning of this from a sympathetic member of the nominating committee, the mathematician Magnus Gösta Mittag-Leffler, wrote to insist that any prize honoring this discovery without his wife would misrepresent whose work it actually was. The nomination was corrected. Marie Curie became the first woman ever to receive a Nobel Prize. Tragedy interrupted what should have been the Curie's most settled years. In April 1906, Pierre stepped into the street in the rain, distracted, and was struck and killed by a horse-drawn cart, his skull crushed beneath its wheel. Marie, 38 years old and the mother of 2 young daughters, was left to carry a research program neither of them had finished alone. The Sorbonne offered her Pierre's vacated professorship, making her, when she accepted, the first woman to teach at the university in its entire 6.5-century history. She stayed at the bench. In 1911, she was awarded a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry alone, for the isolation of pure radium metal and the study of its compounds. It made her the first person of any gender to win the Nobel Prize twice, and to this day, the only person ever to win it in 2 distinct scientific fields. That same year brought the ugliest episode of her public life. The French press exposed a romantic relationship between Marie, then a widow of 43, and Paul Langevin, a former student of Pierre's and a brilliant physicist in his own right, who was, at the time, unhappily married and separated from his wife. The affair itself, by the standards of the time and by many accounts since, was consensual and, by the time it became public, largely over. What followed was not really about the relationship. Newspapers seized on Marie's foreignness, her Polish origins, and her refusal to perform conventional widowhood, framing a private matter as a national scandal, complete with a duel that was actually fought, pistols raised at the Parc des Princes between Langevin and the journalist Gustave Thierry, though neither man fired a shot. The controversy briefly threatened her Nobel Prize itself. The Swedish Academy privately suggested she might not wish to attend the ceremony. She went anyway, informing them pointedly that the prize was for her scientific work, not her personal life, and that the two had no bearing on each other. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Curie redirected her scientific standing toward something almost entirely practical: battlefield medicine. Recognizing that X-ray imaging could help military surgeons locate shrapnel and set fractures far more accurately, she personally organized a fleet of mobile radiography units, vehicles nicknamed Petites Curies, Little Curies, and trained over 100 women, including her own teenage daughter Irene, to operate them near the front lines. It is estimated that more than 1 million wounded soldiers were X-rayed through the program she built essentially from nothing, funded in part by her own Nobel Prize winnings, which she attempted to donate to the war effort outright before being persuaded that the currency of her prestige, not the cash, was of more lasting use. After the war, she devoted her remaining years to the Radium Institute in Paris, the research center built around her and Pierre's work, training a generation of scientists, her daughter Irene foremost among them, who would go on to win her own Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935. In 1921, an American journalist named Marie Maloney organized a public fundraising campaign and a widely publicized tour of the United States, culminating in President Warren Harding personally presenting Curie with a single gram of radium, a substance that, by that point, had become so scarce and so expensive that the gift represented a small fortune extracted from thousands of ordinary donors. By the early 1930s, decades of handling radioactive material without any of the protective protocols later generations of scientists would take for granted had taken a severe and irreversible toll on her body. She died on the 4th of July, 1934, at a sanatorium in the French Alps of aplastic anemia, a failure of the bone marrow to produce healthy blood cells, consistent with, and now widely attributed by historians of medicine to, the cumulative effect of prolonged radiation exposure across nearly 4 decades of laboratory work. Much of Marie Curie's life is unusually well documented by the standard of historical biography. She left extensive laboratory notebooks, correspondence, and her own published memoir of Pierre, and her scientific claims were independently verified and built upon by the international physics community within her own lifetime. Even so, several details commonly repeated about her deserve a more careful accounting than popular tradition gives them. The 1903 Nobel nomination episode is sometimes flattened into a simple story of the Academy trying to exclude a woman outright. The documented record, primarily through Mittag Leffler's surviving correspondence with Pierre Curie, supports the core claim Marie's name was initially absent from the nomination, but the available evidence points to procedural convention and oversight in how the discovery's attribution had been drafted rather than a formal, deliberate policy decision to exclude her because of her sex. The distinction matters though it does not make the omission any less consequential or any less telling about the assumptions embedded in that convention. The image of the Curies keeping tubes of glowing radium salts in their bedroom to admire at night is not later embellishment. It comes directly from Marie's own memoir of Pierre, making it a well-sourced primary account rather than popular myth. What is worth flagging is the modern tendency to retell this detail purely as poetic foreshadowing of her death, when the couple could not have understood at the time that the glow they found beautiful was also a hazard. Treating it as knowing tragic irony imposes a foresight on them that the historical evidence does not support. Her cause of death is frequently stated as a simple, certain fact. Radiation killed her. And while the aplastic anemia diagnosis and the causal link to radiation exposure are well supported by her medical history and by subsequent scholarship on radiation biology, contemporary physicians in 1934 did not have modern diagnostic tools, and no controlled study isolated radiation as the sole causative factor during her lifetime. The attribution is the strong consensus of historians of science and medicine, not a claim recorded with laboratory certainty by her own doctors at the time. Finally, the claim that her laboratory notebooks remain radioactive today, stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France with visitors required to sign a liability waiver before handling them, is accurate and independently verifiable. One of the rare cases where a striking, oddly mythic-sounding detail about Marie Curie turns out to be simply, literally true. Marie Curie discovered a force that helped illuminate the interior of the atom, treated cancer, and eventually, in other hands, split the world into a before and after it could scarcely control. She pursued that discovery with almost no protection, working for years in the very radiation that would eventually kill her, at a moment when no one, including her, understood what protection would have even required. It leaves an uncomfortable question sitting at the center of her achievement, one she never got to answer for herself. How much of what she gave the world was courage, and how much was simply the price of knowledge that hadn't yet learned how to protect the people brave enough to go looking for it. Every portrait has more behind it. If you want to dive deeper into lives like this, to discover more detail, more context, and more of what didn't make this episode, you can explore the range of portraits of the past ebooks that are available now. Link in the description and bio. The paint is dry on this story, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to Portraits of the Past. The next exhibit awaits.